This is a review of The Art of the Lord of the Rings, and it's kind of a weird book to review because, on the one hand, in an objective sense, I absolutely hate it, and I think the approach the publisher and author have taken is pretty despicable. But on the other hand, as a huge fan of these movies, I simply can't not recommend it, because the truth is, if I had my time again, I would still get this book despite my animosity towards it. I mean, even 99% of fans shouldn't even bother with this book, but for the mega completist fan of the movies or the first three Lord of the Rings art books, then there is still a notable amount of exclusive and good content in this book. So before I rant too far ahead of myself in today's episode of Lamentations of a Fanboy, let's just get a clear picture of what this book is. So where the three Lord of the Rings movies each had their own art book, this one is essentially a compilation of concept art from the trilogy as a whole, but it's not just a complete bind-up of the three individual books. Tons of stuff has been cut out as well as new stuff added in. I mean, just to give some indication of how much has been cut, altogether the individual art books would run 600 pages, whereas this book is only 220. Now, if this were just an abridged version of the individual art books, I wouldn't have a problem with that. Or if it was a complete bind-up of the first three art books with some new stuff added in, and that new stuff was significant enough to warrant double dipping, I'd grumble a bit, but at least I could then give away the three first art books. But as it stands with this nonsense of cutting content out and adding new content in, if you want the most complete collection of Lord of the Rings art, you now have to have all four books taking up space on your shelf, even though this fourth volume is mostly just stuff reprinted from the first three. What really pisses me off is how in the introductions to the first three books, the author, Gary Russell, repeatedly laments how hard it was to choose the best art from the thousands and thousands of pieces created for the films to include in the limited space available in the books. Now, if that were true, which I'm sure it is, surely the smart idea would be to have this fourth volume act as kind of an appendices that collects up a bunch of new art from the trilogies that didn't make it into the first three books, thus creating a whole new supplemental book, as opposed to him making a fool of himself by having this book reprint so much of the stuff that's already been seen. And I just find it so unacceptable for a publisher and author to do something that is either completely moronic and ill thought out, or just so disrespectful as to try and coax fans into repurchasing something they've already paid you for once. Now, you could say, well, this is just a lazy way for them to make a quick buck, which is often true. But with this book specifically, and I'll talk about this more a little bit later on, they've actually completely redesigned the layout and placement and pages and everything, which is just insane, because if you're going to go to that effort, why not invest that time and energy into creating something that is actually worthwhile? In the introduction of this book, he tries pitifully to justify why so much of the art has been reprinted, saying that in the individual volumes they crammed so much art in there that many of the pieces weren't able to be reproduced in a way they deserved. This is essentially complete and utter bullshit. Yes, there are a number of instances where images have been reproduced larger or better, but there is also an equal number that are also smaller or worse, or presented only slightly differently, none of which has any impact on the images, as when I was reading the first three, there was almost never an instance where I thought, oh, this image is too small or something like that. It's kind of like having a crazy relative who thinks they're a bit of a handyman, and in an effort to fix something that was never really broken in the first place, ends up breaking something else in the process. So his whole rationale for this book is a lie, and a dumb lie at that. And on top of that, this book now has me retroactively disliking the earlier books for faults I wasn't initially aware they had. For example, on the left here we have an image with Sauron in it as it appeared in the Art of the Fellowship book, and on the right is the same piece from this book. As you can see, the one from Fellowship, it's much bigger, huge 2-page spread, but it's cropped. So this book now has me annoyed with the earlier 3 books by pointing out weaknesses in them that I was previously blissfully unaware of. This ridiculous approach of cutting things out, adding things in, changing things all around isn't exclusive to the images either. Likewise, the commentary from the designers that was featured throughout the books. Some stuff has been taken out, some stuff has been added in to accompany new pieces, new stuff has been added in to accompany old pieces, and sometimes, bizarrely, just a line will have been taken out or added or changed. If you watched my video on The Art of the Two Towers, you'll know one of the reasons I praised those books so highly was because of the quality and quantity of the commentary. Well, even on that front, this book shoots itself in the foot because even though there is some new commentary, there's a lot less overall. In the introduction, the author says this is because in this volume he wanted to focus more on the images than the words. Now, if this was any other author saying this about any other art book, I'd say, well, that's a fair enough reason. But when it comes to this book, I'm thinking, are you sure you didn't just do it because you're a lazy douchebag who wanted to get away with doing the least work possible? I know it may seem like I'm being pretty ratty towards an author who previously gave me 3 art books I adored, but, look at George Lucas or Benioff and Weiss. Unfair as it is, this is what happens when you decide to get stupid and piss all over your previous work. I mean, the whole thing is just a mess. It doesn't fit well as a 4th book in the series, and it doesn't complement the first 3 at all, because, like I mentioned earlier, it's revealing weaknesses in the first 3, and on top of that, it's just a nightmare to try and use in conjunction with them. For example, like what I wanted to do here was just present a slideshow highlighting the new pieces that are exclusive to this book to help you decide if you do think it's worth the rebuy. But even figuring out which were the new pieces was such a pain in the ass because, like I said, they've completely changed the layout of the images. So instead of being organized and laid out like the Fellowship was, which was done based on the type of art, like creatures, costumes, locations, etc., which was fine, or laying them out in a geographical/chronological order like the other 2, which is also fine. This one is organized by artist, which is an incredibly dumb idea for a concept art book because it means you can't compare like all the Urukai designs, for example, because in this book they're spread all over the place. So what we have been seeing now is the slideshow of the new images, but you do want to take it with a grain of salt because even though I'm definitely showing every piece of art that is exclusive to this book, but because of the challenges I mentioned before, you might also see some pieces that actually were in one of the previous 3 books. So if anything, this slideshow is an overestimation of how many new pieces there are in this book. And so based on that, it's hard to give an exact accounting of how many new pieces this book presents, but roughly about 80% of the images in this book are just reprinted from the first 3 art books. And honestly, in terms of the new stuff, I personally don't think it's especially amazing. It's certainly not worth buying the book for unless you are an obsessive idiot like myself. So yes, clearly I think this book is an utter disgrace. Clearly I think the people responsible are brain-dead scum. But in terms of final judgment, I feel really torn because on the one hand, the sort of objective book reviewer in me wants to say that no one should ever buy this book and support these sort of despicable practices. However, the subjective, irrational fanboy in me does recognize that there probably are other sort of top-tier fans who will kind of enjoy this. Like I said, if I had my time again, I would still get this book. I am never going to get rid of it. All the negatives aside, I do enjoy seeing and having access to all the new art and new commentary, but that's just it. You have to remember that this is coming from someone for who these are my favorite movies. So if, like me, you are a huge fan and want the complete experience, you may very well think the same. If, however, you're a more reasonable, well-adjusted person and you don't need everything ever printed on these movies, then I would just stick with the 3 individual art books because this book is not worth it.